A mysterious puppy appears on the seat of a luxury car, dragging its owner into a hidden world of secrets and dangers. What seemed like a mere coincidence turns out to be a conspiracy no one has ever dared to face. The night in New York City pulsed with its characteristic energy as Henry Vance adjusted his Italian silk tie in front of the hotel bathroom mirror. The reflection showed him the image of a man in his 40s, graying hair at his temples and penetrating green eyes that carried the weight of well-kept secrets. He had just participated in another tedious event of the New York elite, where fake smiles and superficial conversations were the currency. He consulted the platinum watch on his wrist, a gift he had given himself upon closing his first billion-dollar deal. It was past midnight. The hotel lobby was already practically empty, except for a few discreet employees maintaining the establishment's night routine. His steps echoed on the marble floor as he headed to the elevator that would take him to the underground parking garage. The metallic sound of the elevator doors closing marked the beginning of a descent that would change his life forever. Henry didn't know it, but that night would not just be another in his calculated routine. The fluorescent lights in the parking garage flickered slightly, creating an almost cinematic environment among the rows of luxury cars. His red Ferrari F8 Tributo was parked in a preferred spot, gleaming under the irregular lighting. The echo of his footsteps mingled with the distant sound of the city that never slept. As he approached the vehicle, something caught his attention. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement inside the car. Henry stopped, his senses sharpened by years of tense negotiations, alerting him that something was out of place. He pressed the alarm button and the car lights flashed, revealing a shadow in the back seat. His first instinct was to back away, but something stopped him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fate. Cautiously, he approached the driver's door. Through the tinted glass, he could make out a trembling movement. His heart raced, but his hands remained steady as he opened the door. The car's interior was exactly as he had left it, except for one detail that would change everything. Curled up in the back seat, an exotic-looking cub stared at him with eyes that seemed to contain all the mystery of the universe. The animal was no bigger than a tennis ball, with fur mottled in shades of gold and black that Henry had never seen before. Its eyes, a deep amber, shone with an almost supernatural intensity. The small being trembled, clearly debilitated, but there was something more to its presence, something that didn't belong to this world of superficiality and appearances. "How did you end up here?" Henry murmured, more to himself than to the cub. Years of business experience had taught him to always seek answers, and this situation screamed that there was much more behind what his eyes could see. Instinctively, he pulled out his latest model smartphone from his Italian suit pocket. With a few taps, he accessed the hotel's security system, one of the advantages of being one of the establishment's largest investors. The parking garage camera footage began to play on his screen, rewinding in time. That's when he saw it. A figure dressed completely in black, moving with the precision of a professional between the cars. The exact moment when the intruder placed the cub in his car was captured with clinical clarity by the high-definition cameras. The person knew exactly where the cameras were positioned, but still allowed themselves to be filmed. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. Henry looked at the cub again, which now observed him with a mixture of fear and hope. In his years of building an empire, he had learned to trust his instincts, and at that moment, all of them were screaming that he was facing something much bigger than it seemed. He picked up the phone again, this time looking for a number he hadn't used in a long time. After 3 rings, a female voice answered, bringing with it a wave of memories he had tried hard to bury. "Megan, I need your help," he said, his voice maintaining the professional composure that characterized him, even as his world began to spin on a new axis. "I have a peculiar situation on my hands." On the other end of the line, the silence that followed was loaded with history, the history of a relationship that had ended abruptly years ago when Henry chose his empire over love. Megan Davis, the most respected veterinarian in New York, was the last person he wanted to contact, but also the only one he could trust at that moment. "Henry," her voice finally responded, carrying a mixture of surprise and hesitation. "After so long." "I know," he interrupted her, his eyes fixed on the cub that seemed increasingly debilitated. "But this is bigger than both of us. I need you to see something. Someone. It's an emergency." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity until Megan finally responded, "My clinic in an hour. Don't be late." Henry hung up the phone and carefully approached the cub. The small being didn't back away, as if it knew its life depended on this moment. With a gentleness that would surprise anyone who knew only the business side of Henry, he wrapped the animal in his silk handkerchief and secured it safely. As he drove through the empty streets of New York, Henry couldn't help but think that this unexpected encounter was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. His instinct told him he was about to dive into deep and dangerous waters, but something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, propelled him to move forward. Megan Davis's veterinary clinic stood out in the New York night like a beacon of modernity. The glass and steel building, illuminated by soft lights, reflected the prestige of its owner. Henry parked the Ferrari at the entrance, aware that every minute was precious for the small being trembling in his lap. Megan was waiting at the door, her brown hair tied in a messy bun that betrayed she had been yanked from sleep. She wore a lab coat over casual clothes, and her green eyes, which had once been his safe harbor, now studied him with a mixture of professional curiosity and personal distrust. "5 years," she said without preamble as she led him inside the clinic. "5 years without a word, and suddenly you call me in the middle of the night." Henry felt the weight of those words, but kept his focus on what was urgent. Carefully, he unwrapped the silk handkerchief, revealing the cub. Megan's reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, and she automatically went into professional mode. "For heaven's sake, where did you find this?" she asked, already putting on gloves and preparing an examination table. Her voice had a tone of astonishment that Henry had never heard before. "In my car, someone deliberately put it there," he replied, watching as Megan began to examine the animal with expertise. "What exactly is it?" Megan didn't answer immediately. Her skilled fingers ran over the cub's body, which remained strangely calm under her touch. She took a small flashlight and examined the animal's eyes, frowning in concentration. "In 15 years of practice, I've never seen anything like it," she murmured, more to herself than to Henry. "The bone structure, the fur coloration, the conformation of the eyes. This isn't a common species, Henry. In fact, I'm not sure if it's a known species at all." She moved to a state-of-the-art ultrasound machine, sliding the device over the cub's body. The images that appeared on the screen made her catch her breath. "This is impossible," she whispered, adjusting the equipment several times, as if she didn't believe what she was seeing. "The internal structure. There are modifications that shouldn't exist naturally." Henry approached the screen, trying to understand what was causing Megan so much astonishment. Even to his untrained eyes, there was something different about the images, structures that seemed to have been altered, adapted. "Henry!" Megan turned to him, her expression now laden with concern. "This isn't just an exotic animal. Someone genetically manipulated this being, and from what I'm seeing, with technology that shouldn't exist yet." She picked up a small device and passed it over the cub's body until a sharp beep sounded. With surgical precision, she parted some fur, revealing something that made Henry hold his breath. A tiny mark, almost invisible to the naked eye, glowed under the animal's skin. "It's an identification code," Megan explained, her voice trembling slightly. "But it's not a common microchip. This technology, it's something completely new. Henry, wherever this cub came from, it's part of something much bigger and much more dangerous." The businessman felt a shiver run down his spine. In his years of dealing with high-risk business, he had developed a sixth sense for trouble, and all his instincts were screaming that he was facing something that could shake structures far beyond his understanding. "I need a favor," he said, his voice assuming the tone he used in crucial negotiations. "Do you know any private investigator? Someone discreet and competent?" Megan studied him for a moment as if weighing her options. "Garrett Anderson," she answered finally. "He's the best at what he does, and more importantly, He knows how to keep a secret. He's worked on some delicate cases for the clinic. While Megan cared for the cub, administering fluids and vitamins, Henry made the call. Garrett answered. On the second ring, his voice alert even at that hour of the morning. The conversation was brief and objective, exactly how Henry liked it. He'll be here in 30 minutes, he informed Megan, who was now gently stroking the cub's head. The small being had visibly relaxed under her care, its extraordinary eyes now half closed in an induced sleep. What exactly do you intend to do, Henry? Asked Megan, her voice carrying a concern that went beyond the professional. This is bigger than us. If what I'm thinking is correct, we're dealing with something that could be extremely dangerous. Henry approached the sleeping cub, observing how its breathing had normalized under Megan's care. Something inside him, something that had long been stifled by ambition and power, was beginning to awaken. I'm going to discover the truth, he replied, his voice firm. Someone chose to involve me in this, and I want to know why. But first, we need to ensure he stays safe. Megan nodded, understanding that despite the years of distance, she still knew the man in front of her well. When Henry Vance made a decision, nothing in the world could dissuade him. The distant sound of a siren cut through the silence of the early morning, reminding them that the world out there continued turning, oblivious to the mystery unfolding inside that clinic. But for Henry and Megan, nothing would be the same again. The small being sleeping on the examination table between them had just changed the course of their lives in a way that neither of them could imagine. Garrett Anderson arrived at the clinic exactly as Megan had described him, discreet and professional. He was a man of average height, with observant brown eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the environment. He wore a dark blazer over a light shirt, and his shoes, though worn, were impeccably clean, the mark of someone who values discretion above ostentation. Mr. Vance, he greeted with a firm handshake, before turning to Megan with a respectful nod. Dr. Davis. Henry observed how the investigator immediately focused his attention on the sleeping cub, his trained eyes registering every peculiar detail of the animal. Without saying a word, Garrett approached the examination table, taking a small electronic device from his pocket that he began to pass over the cub's body. Interesting, he murmured, more to himself than to the others. Very interesting. What exactly are you looking for? Asked Henry, intrigued by the investigator's methodical behavior. Garrett raised his eyes from the device, his face maintaining a neutral expression that years of experience had perfected. Electronic traces. Any animal that undergoes advanced genetic modification usually carries more than one form of identification. The mark that Dr. Davis found is just the tip of the iceberg. Megan and Henry exchanged surprised looks. How did he know about the genetic modifications without them mentioning it? Don't look so surprised, Garrett continued, a slight smile appearing at the corner of his lips. In recent months, I've been investigating similar cases, genetically modified animals appearing in unlikely places, always with sophisticated markings, always involving influential people. The investigator put away his device and sat down in one of the examination room chairs, his face assuming a more serious expression. What you've found here is not an isolated case. It's part of something much bigger, something that's happening behind the scenes of the American elite. Henry felt a weight form in his stomach. Why would someone put this cub specifically in my car? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Responded Garrett, leaning forward. Do you have enemies, Mr. Vance? Someone who would like to see you involved in a scandal? All billionaires have enemies, Henry replied dryly. But this seems different, more personal. Megan, who had remained silent, approached with some test results in hand. The preliminary results show alterations I've never seen before. The cellular structure has been modified in a way that shouldn't be possible with current technology. Garrett nodded, as if confirming something he already suspected. There's a group, very select and very well funded, that is years ahead in genetic research. They operate through exclusive events, private auctions where specimens like this are traded for astronomical values. And how do you know all this? Questioned Henry, his businessman's instinct warning him to be cautious. The investigator smiled. Again, but this time the smile didn't reach his eyes. Because I lost someone very important investigating this group. Since then, I've been following their activities, gathering information, waiting for the right moment to expose them. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft sound of medical equipment monitoring the cub. Megan was the first to speak, so it's not a coincidence. Someone deliberately chose Henry. Exactly, confirmed Garrett. And in the next 48 hours, there will be one of these exclusive auctions in Miami, an isolated mansion, only for selected guests. The type of event where billionaires like Mr. Vance wouldn't raise suspicions. Henry began to understand the plan that was forming. You want me to go to this auction? Not just that, replied Garrett, his eyes shining with determination. I want both of us to go. You will be my entry into a world I've been trying to infiltrate for months, and maybe together we can discover why someone wanted to involve you in all of this. Megan stepped forward, her expression worried. It's very risky. These people, if they discover... That's why we need to act with extreme caution, interrupted Garrett. Every move must be calculated, every word measured. One mistake could cost much more than money. Henry walked to the clinic window, observing the city lights that were beginning to go out with the approach of dawn. In his years of building his empire, he had learned to recognize when he was facing a significant crossroads. This was one of those moments. How long do we have to prepare, he asked, his decision already made. The auction is the day after tomorrow, replied Garrett. Enough time to create your credentials and elaborate our strategy. But first, we need to ensure the cub's safety. He stays here, Megan declared firmly. My clinic has the best security system in New York, and I can monitor him 24 hours a day. Henry turned to face her, finding in her eyes the same determination that had made him fall in love with her years ago. Are you sure? This could be dangerous. For you too. I'm already involved, she replied simply. Besides, someone needs to figure out exactly what they did to this little being. The sun was beginning to rise on the New York horizon, its first golden rays penetrating through the clinic windows. The cub stirred in its induced sleep, as if sensing that its fate was being decided at that moment. The next 24 hours transformed into a whirlwind of preparations. Garrett had turned Henry's penthouse into an improvised operations center, with laptops, communication equipment, and detailed floor plans of the Miami mansion where the auction would take place. The place is a fortress, explained the investigator, pointing to the holographic plans floating in the air through a state-of-the-art projector. Cutting-edge security system, armed guards disguised as staff, and most importantly, a facial recognition system connected to a private database. Henry, who had just returned from a visit to Megan's clinic, carefully observed every detail. How? Did you get this information? I have my contacts, Garrett replied vaguely, his fingers dancing over a holographic keyboard. The important thing is that I managed to insert your data into the system. When we get there, you'll be recognized as one of the legitimate guests. The businessman poured himself a cup of coffee, his third since dawn. And what about you? How will you get in? As your investment consultant, explained Garrett, a discreet smile appearing on his face. These events always have people like me, assistants, consultants, experts. Nobody pays much attention to us, which is exactly what we need. Henry's phone vibrated. It was a message from Megan. The latest analyses of the cub had revealed more anomalies, genetic modifications so advanced that they defied current scientific understanding. Along with the message, she sent some images that made Henry frown. Look at this, he said, passing the phone to Garrett. Megan found patterns in the genetic modifications. She says they look like signatures. The investigator studied the images with renewed interest. This confirms my suspicions. Each scientist involved in these experiments leaves their mark, a kind of genetic signature. It's like an artist signing their work. A very dangerous work of art, commented Henry, remembering the cub's extraordinary eyes. The most concerning thing, continued Garrett, returning the phone, is that some of these signatures belong to scientists who officially no longer exist, people who supposedly disappeared years ago. A chill ran down Henry's spine. In his world of business, he was used to secrets and lies. But this was different. It was something that went beyond common greed, something that messed with the very foundations of nature. "We need a plan B," he declared, years of experience in difficult negotiations speaking louder. "If something goes wrong at the auction—" "I've already thought about that," interrupted Garrett, activating a new projection. "The mansion is close to the sea. There's a small cove 2 kilometers away, where I'll keep a boat prepared, in case of emergency. We have an escape route." The rest of the day was dedicated to refining every detail of the plan. Henry had to make several calls, canceling appointments, and reorganizing his schedule for the next few days. To the outside world, he would be on a routine business trip to Miami. In the late afternoon, they received an unexpected visit. Megan arrived at the penthouse carrying a metal briefcase with sophisticated medical equipment. "The cub is stable," she informed, placing the briefcase on the table. "But I discovered something you need to see before going to the auction." She opened the briefcase, revealing a set of miniaturized medical devices. "These are state-of-the-art biomedical sensors. I managed to adapt them to detect the specific genetic signatures we found in the cub. If there are other modified animals at the auction, we'll know." Henry observed the small devices with admiration. Megan had always been brilliant, but this was beyond his expectations. "How did you manage this so quickly?" "Let's say I have some friends at the university who don't ask many questions," she replied with a half smile. "Besides, I'm not the only one concerned about what's happening. There are people in the scientific community who have suspected these genetic modifications for years, but never managed to get concrete proof." Garrett examined the sensors with professional interest. "This can be extremely useful. If we can map which types of modifications are being auctioned, we can start to trace a pattern." "Just be careful," warned Megan, her concern evident. "These sensors are prototypes. If someone at the auction has advanced detection equipment—" "They won't," assured Garrett. "Trust me, I've already checked the electronic security of the place. They look for weapons, explosives, recording devices, nothing as specific as this." The sun was beginning to set over New York, painting the sky in dramatic tones that seemed to foreshadow the events of the night. In less than 24 hours, they would be in Miami, diving headfirst into a world of secrets and forbidden experiments. "There's still time to back out," Megan said softly, her eyes meeting Henry's. He shook his head, determined. "Not after what we've seen. Someone chose to involve me in this, and now I want to know why." What none of them knew was that at that exact moment, surveillance cameras discreetly positioned across the street were recording every movement inside the penthouse. In a dark room miles away, watchful eyes observed the preparations and plans were adjusted accordingly. Henry's private jet cut through the morning sky towards Miami. From the window, he watched the sunrise paint the clouds pink and gold, colors that reminded him of the exotic fur of the cub they had left in Megan's care. Garrett was seated across from him, reviewing data on his tablet with the concentration of a surgeon before a delicate operation. "The invitations have arrived," announced the investigator, passing an elegant black envelope to Henry. "Cutting-edge technology. The QR code contains more than just identity confirmation. There's a whole fabricated story about your supposed interest in rare specimens." Henry examined the invitation, admiring the sophistication of the work. The paper had a unique texture, and the discreet embossed logo seemed to change color depending on the angle of the light. "How long did it take to create this?" "Months," replied Garrett, a glint of professional pride in his eyes. "I've been preparing this infiltration for a long time. Your arrival just accelerated the plans." The flight attendant approached offering coffee, and Henry noticed how Garrett subtly adjusted his posture, perfectly assuming the role of financial consultant. It was like watching an actor donning a character. "The auction starts at 9 in the evening," continued Garrett, after the flight attendant moved away. "But the initial reception is at 7. It's crucial we arrive early. We need to map the environment, identify the exits, observe the other guests." Henry's phone vibrated with a message from Megan. The businessman felt his heart speed up slightly at seeing her name on the screen, a reaction that had been becoming more frequent in recent days. "Any problem with the cub?" asked Garrett, noticing his expression. "No, actually it's good news. Megan managed to completely stabilize his vital signs, and she discovered something interesting. The little one has an extraordinary capacity for cellular regeneration. She's never seen anything like it." Garrett leaned forward, interested. "That would explain the astronomical value of these animals on the black market. Imagine the medical applications of such a discovery. And the risks," added Henry, putting away the phone, "if this technology fell into the wrong hands." The rest of the flight passed in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally landed at the private airport in Miami, an armored Mercedes was already waiting for them on the tarmac. "Courtesy of the event organizers," explained Garrett, as they settled into the luxurious interior of the vehicle. "They like to keep their special guests under constant surveillance." The journey to the beachfront hotel in Miami Beach was smooth, but Henry couldn't help noticing the small details that betrayed the sophistication of the operation. The driver, seemingly casual in his impeccable uniform, had the unmistakable posture of someone with military training. The car windows, besides being bulletproof, had a specific tint of film that made it impossible to photograph the interior. At the hotel, they were received with the deference reserved for the most important guests. The presidential suite was already prepared, with a stunning view of Miami Beach. But neither Henry nor Garrett were interested in the scenery. "We have to prepare," said the investigator as soon as they were alone. He opened his briefcase, revealing a set of innocent-looking equipment. "These are the sensors Megan developed, adapted to look like common accessories." Henry picked up what appeared to be an elegant wristwatch. "And do they really work?" "Theoretically, yes, but we'll only know for sure when we're inside." Garrett began to configure the devices. "The important thing is to stay calm no matter what we find. These people are dangerous and intelligent. They'll be watching every reaction." As they prepared, Henry received another message from Megan. This time it was a photo of the cub, which looked healthier and more alert. Along with the image was a simple text: "Be careful. Something very strange is happening here." "What does she mean by that?" asked Garrett when Henry shared the message. "I don't know, but Megan isn't the type to get alarmed easily." Henry tried to call back, but the call went straight to voicemail. An uncomfortable feeling began to form in his stomach. The Miami sun was beginning to lower on the horizon, painting the sky with dramatic colors that seemed to foreshadow the events of the night. In the luxurious suite, two men prepared to dive into a world of secrets and dangers, each carrying their own motivations and fears. "Last chance to back out," said Garrett, adjusting his tie in the mirror. Henry looked at the photo of the cub on his phone, thinking of Megan and all the mysteries that had brought them here. We didn't come this far to turn back now. What they didn't know was that their arrival in Miami had already been noticed, and that the true players in this dangerous game had already begun to move their pieces on a much larger board than any of them imagined. The mansion hosting the auction was an architectural masterpiece built atop a hill in Coral Gables. Its geometrically perfect gardens cascaded down the slope until they met the natural vegetation of the Florida landscape, creating a surreal fusion between the artificial and the wild. Luxury cars climbed the main driveway in a silent parade of power and wealth. Henry and Garrett arrived punctually at 7 o'clock in another armored Mercedes sent by the organizers. The businessman wore a tailored Italian suit, projecting the perfect image of the eccentric billionaire interested in alternative investments. Garrett, in his role as consultant, kept 2 steps behind, carrying a leather briefcase that contained the disguised sensors. "Good evening, Mr. Vance," greeted an elegant woman at the entrance, her professional smile not reaching her calculating eyes. "I'm Bethany Morgan, the event coordinator. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Henry returned the greeting with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime in high luxury environments. "The pleasure is mine. This is Anthony Santos, my special investments consultant." Bethany barely directed a glance at Garrett, exactly as they had predicted. The social invisibility of employees would be their greatest advantage that night. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive. Contemporary artworks shared space with valuable antiques, and waiters circulated offering champagne in crystal flutes. But what really caught the attention were the discreet smoked glass doors that led to side corridors where occasional movement could be glimpsed. "The special lots are being prepared," explained Bethany, noticing Henry's interest. "Before the main auction, we'd like to offer a private preview for some selected guests. You, of course, are among them." Henry felt the watch on his wrist, Megan's sensor, vibrate subtly. There was something beyond those doors, something that corresponded to the genetic patterns they were looking for. "It would be an honor," he replied, maintaining his composure. Bethany guided them down one of the corridors, the sound of her high heels echoing on the marble floor. The doors opened automatically as they approached, revealing an area that looked more like a state-of-the-art laboratory than part of a mansion. "Our collection is quite unique," continued Bethany, leading them between illuminated displays where extraordinary creatures rested in meticulously controlled environments. "Each specimen is the result of years of research and development." The sensor on Henry's wrist now vibrated constantly. Beside him, he could feel Garrett tense, though the investigator maintained his neutral expression. "Fascinating," commented Henry, stopping in front of a display where a creature similar to the cub he had found was resting. "The coloration is extraordinary." "You have good taste," smiled Bethany. "This is one of our most promising specimens. Its cellular regeneration capacity is impressive," completed a male voice behind them. Henry felt his blood freeze. He knew that voice. Turning slowly, he found himself face to face with Richard Montgomery, one of the biggest names in American finance, and his former mentor. "Henry," smiled Richard, his astute eyes studying every reaction of his ex-pupil. "What a pleasant surprise to find you here. I didn't know you had an interest in this good type of investment." The moment that followed seemed to stretch indefinitely. Henry could feel Garrett's gaze upon him, silently assessing the situation. Bethany observed the interaction with clinical interest, like a scientist studying an unexpected chemical reaction. "Richard," he finally managed to respond, forcing a smile, "the world really is small." "Smaller than we imagine," replied the mentor, his voice carrying a subtext that made all of Henry's instincts scream in alert. "Perhaps we can talk in private later. I'm sure there's much to discuss." Before Henry could respond, his phone vibrated, a message from Megan. His heart almost stopped as he read the text. "We need to talk now, the cub. There's something you need to know." The businessman put away the phone, aware of the attentive looks on him. The night had barely begun, and already he felt they were walking on thin ice. The main auction was yet to come, and with it he suspected would come revelations that would change everything they thought they knew about this operation. "It would be a pleasure, Richard," he finally replied, knowing that every word, every gesture that night could be the difference between success and disaster. "We do indeed have much to discuss." The lights of the laboratory reflected off the metallic surfaces, creating shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Somewhere in the mansion, a discreet gong sounded, announcing that the auction was about to begin. The true presentation of the night was just starting, and with it secrets that few were prepared to discover. The mansion's main hall had been transformed into an elegant auditorium for the auction. Leather armchairs were arranged in concentric semicircles, all facing a circular stage where a glass and metal podium reflected the ambient lights. Henry and Garrett occupied strategic seats close to one of the side exits as they had planned. "We can't answer Megan's call now," whispered Garrett, his voice barely audible over the murmur of guests settling in. "It would be too suspicious to leave right at the beginning of the auction." Henry nodded discreetly, although his stomach was knotted with worry. Megan's message wouldn't leave his mind, and the unexpected presence of Richard Montgomery made everything even more complex. The lights dimmed softly, and Bethany Morgan took the stage. Her long black dress sparkled under the spotlights, creating an almost hypnotic effect. "Dear guests," her melodious voice echoed through the sound system, "it is with great pleasure that we begin our special evening. Before we start the bidding, we would like to introduce the mentor of this revolutionary project, the visionary Dr. Alexander Fields." A tall, thin man appearing to be in his 60s took the stage. His perfectly aligned grey hair and the impeccable white lab coat over a dark suit created an image that blended scientific authority with social elegance. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying a slight European accent. "Tonight is not just about extraordinary acquisitions. It's about the future of evolution, about breaking the barriers of the possible." As the scientist spoke, holographic screens appeared around the auditorium, showing images of ultra-modern laboratories and genetic research results. The sensor on Henry's wrist began to vibrate more intensely. "For the past 10 years," continued Dr. Fields, "our team has been working in secret, developing technologies that surpass the limits of conventional genetic engineering. What we present today are not just modified animals. They are living masterpieces, each carrying unique characteristics that will revolutionize fields such as regenerative medicine and biotechnology." Henry felt a movement beside him and realized that Richard Montgomery had sat down in the empty chair next to him. "Impressive, isn't it?" murmured Richard, without taking his eyes off the stage. "Alexander is a misunderstood genius. The traditional, scientific community would never accept his innovative methods." Before Henry could respond, his phone vibrated again. Another message from Megan. "The cub is showing inexplicable changes. The cellular structure is rapidly altering. We need to talk now." "The first lot of this evening," announced Bethany, "as a circular platform emerged from the center of the stage, is a particularly special specimen." The sensor on Henry's wrist now vibrated so intensely that he had to make a conscious effort not to show discomfort. On the platform, a creature that looked like a larger and more developed version of the cub they had found observed the audience, with extraordinarily intelligent golden eyes. "As you can see," continued Dr. Fields, approaching the creature, "this specimen represents the pinnacle of our research in accelerated cellular regeneration. Its genetic structure has been modified." "To interesting choice to open the auction," interrupted Richard in a low voice, leaning towards Henry, "especially considering the little present you received in your car." Henry felt his blood run cold. Beside him, he noticed Garrett tense almost imperceptibly. "Don't be modest, Henry," continued Richard, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "You don't really think your presence here tonight is a coincidence? That cub simply appeared in your car?" On stage, Dr. Fields continued his presentation, but Henry barely registered the words. His mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what Richard was saying. "Why me?" he finally managed to ask, keeping his voice controlled. "Because you're like me, Henry. You always have been. You have the same vision, the same willingness to cross lines when necessary." Richard paused, his eyes shining with something that seemed almost like pride. "And because you have something we need." Henry's phone vibrated for the third time. This time it wasn't a message, but a photo. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the image. The cub in Megan's clinic had changed. Its body structure was different, more developed, and its eyes were now identical to those of the creature on the stage. "Fascinating, isn't it?" commented Richard, who had leaned over to see the photo. "The metamorphosis is just beginning. Soon, you'll understand your true role in all of this." On stage, the bidding for the first lot had begun, astronomical numbers echoing through the auditorium. But for Henry, the sound seemed distant, muffled by the roar of blood in his ears. He was at the center of something much larger and more dangerous than he had imagined, and each new moment only increased the unanswered questions. The interval between auction lots provided Henry and Garrett with a few precious moments of privacy. In one of the mansion's luxurious bathrooms, away from vigilant eyes, they tried to process the revelations of the last hour. "They planned everything," murmured Garrett, discreetly checking if there were any listening devices in the environment. "The cub, your presence here, nothing was a coincidence." Henry leaned against the marble sink, his mind working furiously. "Richard said I have something they need, but what?" "Maybe it's not something physical," pondered the investigator. "Your position, your contacts, your influence. You have access to circles that could be valuable for an operation of this scale." The businessman checked his phone again. Megan had sent more photos of the cub, each showing more dramatic changes than the last. The transformation was impressive and at the same time disturbing. "We need to get Megan and the cub out of here," Henry decided. "If they know about the animal in the clinic." "I've already taken care of that," interrupted Garrett, surprising. The businessman. As soon as I saw Richard Montgomery, I activated my contingency plan. A trusted team is on their way to the clinic to transfer Megan and the cub to a secure location. Momentary relief passed over Henry's face, but was quickly replaced by concern. How are we going to get out of here? Richard made it clear that I'm at the center of their plans. We need to keep playing the game for now, replied Garrett, adjusting his tie in the mirror. Buy time until Megan is safe. Then, he made a significant pause. Then, we'll turn the tables. Back in the main hall, the auction had entered its most intense phase. The lots presented became increasingly impressive and disturbing. Creatures that defied comprehension were exhibited one after another, each representing a different aspect of the genetic modifications developed by Dr. Fields's team. Richard Montgomery had moved to the front row, but Henry could feel his occasional gaze monitoring every reaction. Beside the stage, Bethany Morgan coordinated the bids with the precision of a conductor, while Dr. Fields provided technical explanations about each specimen. The next lot, announced Bethany, is particularly special, a practical demonstration of the potential of our research. The central platform opened again, revealing something that made Henry catch his breath. It was a creature larger than the previous ones, with characteristics that vaguely resembled various known animals, but combined in a completely new way. Its movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, and its eyes carried a consciousness that seemed almost human. The sensor on Henry's wrist vibrated with an intensity he hadn't felt before. Beside him, Garrett discreetly consulted a small device hidden in his briefcase. The genetic patterns, whispered the investigator, are almost identical to the cubs, but on a much larger scale. On stage, Dr. Fields began an enthusiastic explanation about directed evolution and adaptive potential, but his words were interrupted by a shrill sound coming from the sound system. For a moment, the hall lights flickered. Henry's phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. Phase 1 complete, package secure, awaiting instructions. Garrett saw the message and nodded imperceptibly. Megan and the cub were safe. It was then that Richard Montgomery took the stage, joining Dr. Fields. His smile was that of someone who knew that all the pieces of a complex plan were falling perfectly into place. "Dear friends," he began, his voice carrying a tone of barely disguised triumph. "Before we proceed with the bids, I'd like to make a special announcement. Tonight is not just about extraordinary acquisitions. It's about the future, and to show exactly what I mean." He made a dramatic pause, his eyes finding Henry's in the audience. "I'd like to invite my former pupil, Henry Vance, to join us on stage." The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Henry felt the weight of dozens of gazes upon him as his mind raced to process the implications of this moment. Beside him, Garrett maintained a studied calm, but his hand had moved discreetly inside his jacket, where Henry knew he kept an emergency communication device. It was a decisive moment. Whatever Richard was planning was about to be revealed. And Henry knew that his response to this invitation would change everything. The path to the stage seemed to last an eternity. Each of Henry's steps echoed in the expectant silence of the hall, while his mind rapidly processed his options. Years of difficult negotiations had prepared him for moments of pressure, but this was different, very different. "My most brilliant, or pupil," announced Richard, extending his arm in a theatrical gesture as Henry climbed onto the stage, the man who always knew how to recognize a unique opportunity when he saw one. Dr. Fields observed the scene with clinical interest, his astute eyes evaluating Henry's every reaction. Bethany Morgan had discreetly stepped back, but remained attentive to every movement. "Richard always spoke highly of you," commented the scientist, his soft voice carrying a tone that reminded Henry of a university professor. "Your ability to see beyond the conventional, to understand the true value of innovation. And that's why you're here today," completed Richard, placing a hand on Henry's shoulder in a gesture that to the audience might seem paternal, but that the businessman felt as a subtle threat. To be part of something revolutionary. The sensor on Henry's wrist continued to vibrate, and he could feel that the creature on the central platform was observing him with a disturbing intensity. In the audience, Garrett maintained his financial consultant pose, but his alert eyes didn't miss a single movement. "What exactly do you want from me, Richard?" asked Henry, keeping his voice controlled despite the tension he felt. His former mentor's smile widened. "Always straight to the point. It's one of the qualities I admire most about you." He gestured to Dr. Fields, who activated a remote control. The holographic screens around the hall changed, now displaying images of industrial complexes and high-tech laboratories. "What you see here," continued Richard, "are facilities spread all over the world. Research centers, laboratories, specialized clinics, a global network dedicated to advancing science without the shackles of bureaucracy and conventional morality." "And how you want me to be part of this," concluded Henry, the pieces starting to fit together in his mind. "Not just be part of it," corrected Richard. "We want you to be the public face of our operation. Your unblemished reputation, your contacts in the corporate world, your political influence. You're the missing piece to legitimize our research in the eyes of the world." Dr. Fields approached, his eyes shining with scientific enthusiasm. "Think of the possibilities, Mr. Vance. Accelerated cellular regeneration, curing diseases considered incurable, prolonging human life. All of this is within our reach. We just need someone with your vision to make it acceptable in the eyes of society." Henry felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. Probably more news from Megan about the cub, but he couldn't check now. Not when he was literally at the center of the stage, with all eyes on him. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his calm voice masking the inner storm he felt. Richard's smile didn't waver, but his eyes took on a dangerous gleam. "You've always been too smart to make the wrong choice, Henry. Besides," he gestured to Bethany, who activated another control. A new image appeared on the screens, a live transmission from Megan's clinic, or rather, what was left of it. The place was completely ransacked, with destroyed equipment and documents scattered everywhere. "Your veterinarian friend and the cub may have escaped this time," continued Richard, his voice now carrying a veiled threat. "But how long do you think they can hide, especially considering the changes the little one is undergoing?" Henry maintained his neutral expression, though inside his heart was racing. Garrett's contingency plan had worked. Megan and the cub had been removed before the invasion, but Richard didn't need to know that. Not yet. "You've always been an excellent teacher, Richard," he finally said, choosing his words carefully. "You taught me that the best negotiations are those where everyone wins, so give me some time to consider your proposal. A decision of this magnitude deserves adequate reflection." Richard studied his former pupil for a moment, before slowly nodding. "Always prudent. Very well, you'll have until the end of the auction to give us your answer." He consulted his wristwatch. "Let's say 2 hours." In the audience, Garrett had begun to move discreetly towards the exit, following the plan they had established for emergency situations. Now it was a race against time. 2 hours to execute a plan that could save or condemn much more than just their lives. The cocktail that followed the first part of the auction transformed the main hall into a social theater, where every gesture and word carried second and third intentions. Henry circulated among the guests as if he were at any other elite event, exchanging pleasantries and studied smiles, while his mind worked furiously on the next moves. In a moment of apparent casualness, he managed to approach Garrett, who maintained his dedicated consultant pose near the bar. "Megan and the cub are in the secure location," murmured the investigator, pretending to make notes on his tablet. "But there's something you need to know. Her latest report is concerning." Henry maintained his social smile, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "How concerning?" "The cub isn't just changing physically. Megan detected signs of anomalous brain activity, patterns she's never seen before, and more importantly, she found evidence that it's communicating with other specimens." The information hit Henry like a punch to the stomach. His gaze involuntarily turned to the area where the auction creatures were being kept. The sensor on his wrist began to vibrate more intensely. "How much time do we have?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The plan is in motion." My media contacts are prepared to receive the evidence as soon as we give the signal. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Bethany Morgan, her high heels announcing her arrival on the marble floor. "Mr. Vance," she smiled, "Dr. Fields would like to show you something in particular, if you could accompany me." Henry exchanged a quick look with Garrett before following Bethany. They were led down a different corridor, which descended towards what appeared to be a basement of the mansion. The temperature gradually became cooler, and the exposed concrete walls replaced the luxury of the upper decoration. The underground laboratory was much larger than Henry expected. While the upper floor of the mansion displayed opulence, this space was pure functionality. State-of-the-art equipment occupied every available inch, and technicians in white coats moved efficiently between workstations. "Impressive, isn't it?" commented Dr. Fields, who was waiting for them next to a large data screen. "This is where the true magic happens." Henry observed the information running across the screen: genetic sequences, cellular development graphs, growth projections. Everything seemed infinitely more advanced than any technology he knew. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked directly. The scientist smiled, his eyes shining with genuine enthusiasm. "Because you need to understand that we're not simply exotic animal traffickers, Mr. Vance. We are architects of the future." He led Henry to an area isolated by special glass. In the center, a creature similar to the cub, but at a much more advanced stage of development, observed them with an intelligence impossible to ignore. "What you see is not just a genetic modification," explained Dr. Fields. "It's the next step in evolution. These creatures have capabilities that defy our current understanding of biology: instant cellular regeneration, accelerated environmental adaptation, and the most fascinating, a form of communication among themselves that transcends known methods." The sensor on Henry's wrist now vibrated constantly. The creature in front of him seemed focused on him with a disturbing intensity. "The cub you found in your car," continued the scientist, "was just a test. We wanted to see how it would react to your specific energy field." "My energy field?" repeated Henry, feeling he was about to discover something crucial. "Some humans," explained Dr. Fields with growing enthusiasm, "possess a unique bioenergetic signature, something in their DNA that resonates with our creations in a special way. You, Mr. Vance, are one of those rare individuals." The implications of that revelation were beginning to form in Henry's mind when his phone vibrated. An urgent message from Megan. "The cub is trying to communicate. It's drawing something, and you need to see this." Attached to the message was a photo that made Henry hold his breath. The cub had used its claws to scratch the floor of the secure location, creating a complex pattern of symbols and lines, and in the center of the drawing, something that looked frighteningly like a map that showed exactly where they were at that moment. "Fascinating, isn't it?" commented Dr. Fields, who had approached to see the photo. "The synchronicity has already begun. Soon you'll understand your true role in all of this." On the upper floor, the soft sound of a gong announced that the second part of the auction was about to begin. But Henry barely registered the sound. His mind was focused on a single question: what exactly were these creatures trying to communicate? And why was he so important to their plans? The return to the main hall was like emerging from a disturbing dream into an even more unsettling reality. The auction had resumed, but Henry barely paid attention to the astronomical bids echoing through the room. His mind was focused on the revelations from the underground laboratory and the mysterious message the cub was trying to convey. Garrett approached discreetly, pretending to show some notes on his tablet. "We have a problem," he murmured. "Megan just sent more photos. The cub isn't just drawing maps, it's replicating complex chemical formulas, equations that seem related to the genetic modifications." Henry felt the weight of that information as he observed the current presentation on stage. A new creature was being exhibited, its iridescent scales reflecting the room's lights hypnotically. "This isn't just about money or power," he whispered. "Back. Dr. Fields showed me something in the lab. They're creating a new form of consciousness, something that can communicate beyond the limits we know." The investigator nodded imperceptibly. Megan came to the same conclusion. The brain patterns she detected in the cub, they're like a living neural network, growing and adapting every moment. On stage, Bethany was announcing increasingly higher values, while Richard Montgomery observed everything from his privileged place in the front row. From time to time, his gaze met Henry's, like a patient predator waiting for its prey to make the next move. Henry's phone vibrated again, more photos from Megan. The cub was now drawing complex molecular structures, diagrams that seemed to represent the very process of genetic modification it was undergoing. It was as if it was trying to explain its own transformation. "It's trying to warn us about something," Henry murmured, more to himself than to Garrett. At that moment, the lights in the hall flickered simultaneously. On stage, the creature being auctioned emitted a high-pitched, almost musical sound. The sensor on Henry's wrist began to vibrate, with an intensity that was almost painful. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Fields' voice sounded through the sound system, "I ask for your attention for something extraordinary that is about to happen." The holographic screens around the hall changed, now displaying live images from various laboratories around the world. In each of them, similar creatures were demonstrating the same agitated behavior. "What you are witnessing," continued the scientist, his voice overflowing with excitement, "is the beginning of something revolutionary, a demonstration of the true potential of our creations." Richard Montgomery rose from his seat, a smile of triumph on his face. "And that's why, my dear Henry, your decision is so important. What's happening here goes far beyond simple genetic modifications. We are witnessing the birth of a new form of conscious life." The creatures on display began to move in synchrony, as if responding to an invisible command. On Henry's phone, new messages from Megan arrived in rapid succession. The cub was demonstrating the same behavior. "They're connecting," explained Dr. Fields, his eyes shining with scientific fascination. "Creating a network of collective consciousness that transcends physical distances. And you, Mr. Vance, are somehow a fundamental part of that connection." It was then that Henry felt it, a strange sensation, as if something was trying to reach his mind. Images began to flow into his consciousness. Secret laboratories, forbidden experiments, years of research conducted in the shadows. But there was more, a feeling of urgency, a desperate warning trying to be transmitted. "They're not just communicating," Henry realized, his voice betraying his surprise. "They're trying to show us something that Richard and Dr. Fields don't want us to know." Richard's smile faltered for an almost imperceptible moment. On stage, Dr. Fields began furiously typing commands into his terminal, apparently trying to control the situation. "The creatures," murmured Garrett, observing the monitors, "they're starting to exhibit completely new behavior patterns. It's as if they were rebelling," completed Henry, finally understanding. "They've developed their own consciousness, beyond what their creators planned, and now they're trying to alert us to something much bigger." The hall lights flickered again, more intensely this time. At the center of the stage, the main creature had risen completely, its golden eyes fixed directly on Henry. And at that moment, through a connection that defied all logic and known science, he began to understand the true magnitude of what was about to be revealed. Chaos erupted in the auction. The creatures on display had begun emitting harmonic sounds that resonated throughout the environment, creating an alien symphony that made the crystal chandeliers vibrate. The guests, previously so composed in their gala attire, now moved restlessly, divided between fear and fascination. "Shut everything down," ordered Richard, his voice losing its usual composure. "Dr. Fields, activate the containment protocols." But it was too late. The holographic screens around the hall began displaying a frenzied sequence of images, confidential documents, experiment records, maps of secret facilities. It was as if the creatures themselves were hacking the system, revealing long-buried secrets. "My God," whispered Garrett, his eyes scanning the information unfolding. "They're not just genetic experiments, they're developing biological weapons." Henry could barely process the flow of information invading his mind through the strange connection that had been established. The creatures weren't just experiments, they were prototypes of something much more sinister. Their regeneration and adaptation capabilities were just the surface of a much more ambitious plan. The genetic modifications, he murmured, the pieces finally falling into place. They weren't to benefit humanity. They were to create organisms that could survive extreme events. Richard Montgomery had completely lost his mask of civility. "Security," he shouted. "Isolate the hall. Nobody leaves here." At that moment, Henry's phone vibrated with a new message from Megan. The attached photo showed the cub emitting a soft, pulsating light while continuing to draw increasingly complex patterns. "It's a code," realized Garrett, leaning in to see the image. "The drawings, the patterns, they're trying to show us how to reverse the process, how to stop whatever Richard is planning." On stage, Dr. Fields struggled with his controls, desperately trying to regain dominion over his creations. "Don't you understand?" he shouted, his voice mixing frustration and admiration. "They've evolved beyond our expectations. They've developed a collective consciousness we can no longer control." The lights continued to flicker, and the harmonic sound from the creatures had intensified. Through his special connection, Henry could feel that something monumental was about to happen. "We need to act now," he said to Garrett. "How long until your team is ready?" "The signal has already been given," replied the investigator. "In 5 minutes, all the evidence these creatures are revealing will be broadcast live to the country's main communication networks." Richard must have realized he was losing control of the situation. With a quick movement, he pulled something from his jacket, a small device that made all the creatures writhe in apparent agony. "Enough of this game," his voice thundered through the hall. "You have no idea what's at stake here. Decades of research, billions in investments, but you really think I'm going to let all of this be destroyed?" But his moment of triumph was short-lived. The device in his hand began to emit sparks and suddenly exploded in a shower of electronic components. At the same instant, all the creatures present rose in a synchronized demonstration of power and consciousness. "They're not yours to control," declared Henry, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even himself. "They never were." The few holographic screens now displayed a countdown. In a matter of minutes, the whole world would know the truth about the secret experiments, about the plans to use these creatures as biological weapons, about the conspiracy that hid behind the facade of scientific research. "You don't understand," Richard turned to Henry, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I chose you because you were like me, someone willing to do what's necessary, no matter the cost." "The difference," replied Henry, "is that I learned that some costs are too high." At that moment, the doors of the hall burst open with a bang. News crews flooded the environment, cameras capturing every detail of the surreal scene. Garrett's plan had worked. The truth was about to come out, and there was no way to contain it anymore. The creatures, as if sensing that their mission was accomplished, began to calm down. The harmonic sound gradually diminished, leaving in its place a silence laden with meaning. On Henry's phone, a final message from Megan. "The cub is at peace. They did it. We did it." The chaos that followed the media invasion transformed the elegant auction into a scene worthy of a movie. Flashes fired incessantly, capturing images of the creatures, the documents exposed on the holographic screens, and the shocked faces of guests who moments before had been bidding millions without questioning the origin of what they were buying. Richard Montgomery, for the first time in his public life, seemed to have completely lost control of the situation. His face, normally impassive, alternated between expressions of fury and despair as he tried to prevent reporters from approaching the equipment and creatures. "You have no idea what you've just done," he hissed at Henry, taking advantage of a moment of relative privacy amidst the chaos. "There are very powerful people involved in this, people who won't accept this exposure." "That's why we ensured the broadcast was live," Henry calmly replied. "At this moment, millions of people are watching. There's no way to cover this up." Dr. Fields, unlike Richard, maintained a surprising calm. Sitting in a corner of the stage, he observed his creations with a mixture of pride and resignation. "They surpassed all our expectations," he murmured as Henry approached. "They developed not just consciousness, but morality. Who could have predicted?" Garrett coordinated the team of investigative journalists he had brought, ensuring that every document, every piece of evidence was properly recorded. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Authorities from different agencies were already demanding explanations and access to the site. "The first FBI vehicles are on their way," he informed. "Henry, we need to ensure nothing is destroyed until they get here." It was at this moment that Henry's phone vibrated with a call from Megan. His heart raced as he answered. After everything that had happened, her voice was like a safe harbor amid the storm. "You need to see this," she said without preamble. "The cupboard, it's changing again, but it's different this time." Through the video call, Henry could see the small being that had started it all. Its form was more stable now, and its eyes carried a wisdom that seemed as ancient as time itself. "It wants to talk to you," Megan continued, her voice mixing astonishment and admiration. "They all want to." As if responding to her words, all the creatures present in the hall simultaneously turned to Henry. The harmonic sound resumed, softer this time, almost like a lullaby. "It's a language," realized Dr. Fields, his eyes shining with scientific fascination. "They've developed their own form of communication, and for some reason you're able to understand it." Henry closed his eyes, letting the sensations and images flow through the strange connection he shared with the creatures. It was like diving into an ocean of collective consciousness, where thoughts and emotions mixed in a complex dance of meanings. "They don't want to be weapons," he finally said, opening his eyes. "Neither experiments nor products for sale. They want to be teachers." "Teachers?" repeated Garrett, intrigued. "Yes," confirmed Henry, the pieces finally fitting together in his mind. All this accelerated evolution, the ability to communicate beyond physical limits, cellular regeneration. They weren't characteristics developed for war. They were tools to show us possibilities we never imagined. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "And you think the world is ready for this? To accept that we've created a new form of intelligent life? That this life might be superior to ours in several aspects?" "The world is never completely ready for revolutionary changes," Henry replied. "But sometimes they're necessary." Through the video call, the cub had begun to draw again. But this time, instead of warnings or chemical formulas, it was creating images of a possible future. A future where humans and these new creatures would work together, learning from each other. The first sirens began to sound in the distance, announcing the imminent arrival of the authorities. But Henry barely registered them. His attention was focused on the message the creatures were transmitting. A message of hope, of possibilities, of a different path than what Richard and his associates had planned. "And now?" asked Garrett, observing the lights of the vehicles reflecting in the mansion's windows. "Now," Henry replied, "we start telling a different story. The true story." Morning arrived in Miami, bringing with it a new reality. The front pages of online newspapers exploded with headlines about the genetic auction scandal, while social media overflowed with videos and photos of the extraordinary creatures that had captivated the public's imagination. In the hotel suite overlooking Miami Beach, Henry watched the sunrise while participating in a video conference with Megan. The cub, which now looked more like a young adult of its species, rested peacefully in the background, its presence a constant reminder of the monumental changes that were to come. "The latest analyses are fascinating," Megan reported, her face lit up by the scientific enthusiasm that Henry so admired. "Their genetic structure continues to adapt, but now in a more stable, more harmonious way." Garrett, who was organizing a mountain of documents and evidence, looked up. "And the others, the ones that were at the auction? They've been transferred to a specialized research center," Megan replied. "An international team of ethical scientists has been convened to ensure their well-being and study their capabilities responsibly." Richard Montgomery and Dr. Fields had been detained by the FBI, along with several others involved in the scheme. Preliminary investigations were already revealing a network of corruption and illegal experiments that extended across several countries. "And what about you?" asked Megan, her eyes meeting Henry's through the screen. "How are you dealing with all of this?" Henry unconsciously touched the sensor on his wrist, now a constant reminder of his unique connection with the creatures. It's strange, he admitted. It's like having access to a new way of perceiving the world. They don't think like us, Megan. Their consciousness is different, more integrated, more holistic. The first studies of interspecies communication have already begun, Garrett informed, passing some notifications on his tablet. Universities around the world are fascinated by the possibilities, and your unique ability to connect with them makes you a key piece in this process. Henry smiled, thinking of the irony of the situation. Richard had planned to use him as a spokesperson for a criminal operation, but now he would become an intermediary between two forms of intelligence, helping to build bridges of understanding. Speaking of which, Garrett continued, the first public hearing on the case is scheduled for next week. They want you to testify about your experience. We'll be there with you, Megan assured. Through the screen, the cub raised its head as if agreeing. Henry's phone rang. It was his press office. Interview requests kept pouring in, and the scientific world was particularly interested in his unique ability to communicate with the creatures. You know what's most interesting, he reflected after hanging up. Richard was right about one thing. The world wasn't ready for this. But sometimes the greatest changes happen precisely when we're not ready for them. And now, asked Megan, her soft voice carrying a note of expectation. Now we start learning, Henry replied. Not just about them, but about ourselves. About the limits we imagined we had, and that in reality were just the beginning of something much greater. The sun was already high in the Miami sky, its golden lights reflecting off the waves of Miami Beach. In the hotel suite, 3 people, a businessman, a veterinarian, and an investigator, contemplated the beginning of a new era, an era where the boundaries between different forms of life and consciousness were beginning to dissolve, paving the way for possibilities that until then belonged only to the realm of imagination. They're not just the next step in evolution, said Henry, observing an image of the cub on the screen. They're messengers of something greater, something that has always been there, waiting for us to be ready to see. Megan smiled, that smile that years ago had won his heart, and that now, after everything they had been through together, seemed even more significant. And are you ready to be part of that message? Henry looked at the horizon, where the sky and sea merged into an infinite line of possibilities. I think I always have been. I just didn't know it until now. The cub, through the screen, emitted that harmonic sound that had now become familiar, a melody that carried within it promises of discoveries, of evolution, of a future where different forms of life and consciousness could coexist and learn from each other. It was just the beginning of a much greater journey. 6 months passed since the events at the Miami mansion. Megan's old laboratory had been transformed into a center for interspecies research and communication, funded by the foundation Henry had created especially for this purpose. The white walls now displayed monitors with real-time data on the different colonies of creatures spread around the world, all connected through that mysterious network of consciousness that still defied traditional scientific understanding. The cub, which now responded to the name Aurora, chosen for its ability to bring light to previously obscure questions, had become an ambassador between the two species. Its intelligence and gentleness captivated everyone who met it, from renowned scientists to children visiting the center on school excursions. It's amazing how everything has changed, commented Megan, watching through the window of her new office as a group of researchers interacted with Aurora in the specially designed garden. 6 months ago, we were trying to understand a mystery. Now we're redefining the limits of the possible. Henry smiled, approaching her. Their relationship had been reborn from the ashes of the past, strengthened by the extraordinary experiences they had shared. And to think it all started with an unexpected encounter in a parking garage. Speaking of encounters, interrupted Garrett, entering the room with his inseparable tablet, I just received the latest updates on the trial. Richard and Dr. Fields have accepted a cooperation agreement. They're providing information about the entire international network involved in the illegal experiments. Dr. Fields, in particular, had shown genuine remorse. His research, although initially conducted for questionable purposes, was now being reviewed and adapted to benefit humanity. Under strict supervision, He continued studying the creatures, but now with a new purpose: to understand and learn, not to control and exploit. "And the other facilities?" asked Henry, remembering the secret laboratories revealed on that fateful night. "Most have been converted into legitimate research centers," Garrett replied. "The international scientific community is working together to ensure that all knowledge is used ethically." Aurora entered the room, its fluid movements carrying a grace that still impressed. Through his special connection, Henry could feel the other creatures' satisfaction with the direction things had taken. "They always knew," said Henry, interpreting the thoughts Aurora was sharing. "From the beginning, they knew we needed to learn to expand our consciousness, to see beyond our self-imposed limitations." Megan approached Aurora, gently caressing its head. "And they chose you to be the bridge." "Not just me," Henry corrected. "All of us. Every person who allows themselves to question, learn, evolve. That's why they revealed themselves now, because we're finally ready to take the next step." The soft sound of an electronic gong announced the beginning of another interspecies communication session. In the garden, researchers and creatures gathered in a circle, preparing for another exchange of knowledge that continued to surprise everyone with its revelations. "You know what's most extraordinary?" Megan reflected as they watched the scene. "It's not just the scientific discoveries, the medical possibilities, or the technological advances. It's how they taught us to see the world in a different way, more connected, more conscious." Henry nodded, feeling through his connection with Aurora the constant flow of wisdom and understanding that the creatures shared. "They showed us that evolution isn't just about physical adaptation or technological development. It's about expanding our consciousness, our ability to understand and connect with all forms of life." In the garden, the communication circle had begun. The harmonic sound of the creatures mingled with human voices in a symphony that symbolized the beginning of a new era of understanding and cooperation between species. "And this," Henry concluded, "is just the beginning." Aurora emitted a soft, almost musical sound that everyone in the room had learned to recognize as a sign of approval and hope. Through it echoed the promise of a future where the barriers between different forms of life and consciousness would continue to dissolve, revealing possibilities that we were only beginning to glimpse.